About 12 years ago, though, I met my partner, Mike, and we adopted 3 children, and all of them are Black. And I think that really gave urgency to this issue as I'm, tending to these little babies and have big dreams for their lives. And this gnawing, concern, that kind of follows you as they're growing up. Like, what could happen? Anything could happen just due to the color of their skin. I think the core curiosity for me is why would we lock up our most precious resource we have? The original question I had was, does the U.S. really lock up more people than any other industrial, nation? And is it about crime or deeper forces? What's behind this?
So it's interesting you asked that question, actually, the prior question about why would we do this, and that it just seems out, bizarre. That's actually the premise that I come to this work with every day. What are we doing? This is ridiculous. Even if we take the inhumane piece out of it, it's just ridiculous. It's an archaic, absurd model. It is based on, so many premises that are false. And I think it's the thing, for me, it's what prompted me to get involved in this work in the first place. And some of that is because I come to this work not as a criminologist or a lawyer. Everyone assumes when they hear about my work that I am one of those things, and I'm not. My background, I have a PhD in literature and African American studies.
Oh, I never thought about that. Yeah.
I think that benefits. For me, I see that as a benefit to the work in that I'm always thinking outside the box of it. And I'm always looking at this as this being mass incarceration, whether in the US or in South Africa or Thailand. I'm looking at it as a bizarre thing. So to your question, the other question, Kim, is the US the world's the world's biggest incarcerator? We're actually number 2 now. We were for many years. We have 5% of the world's population, 25% of its prison population. Our numbers are staggering. I often call the US the McDonald's of mass incarceration because, we do everything big. But per capita, we've actually been outdone in the last couple of years by El Salvador. And that is, on account of the state of emergency in that country and the dedication to mass incarceration on those shores and Bukele's administration and so on. When I talk about the US doing it big, it's not only in terms of our numbers, it's also in terms of our system being the quote unquote model for the world and the template for the world. And we, both historically and today, are the pushers and the sellers of mass incarceration to the world. We finance the building of prisons around the world, historically and today. We are seen as the model for this kind of justice around the world. And so our outside presence in this work is not just about, our numbers. It's also about our influence, as it is with everything. We're the US, we export Coca-Cola, we export hip hop, and then we export mass incarceration.
Gosh, it's interesting to hear you say that you don't come to this with a legal background, or I hadn't thought about that. That's really interesting. On this one board that I'm on, I'm the only non-lawyer. And they invited me to join because they want to start involving the kind of, I guess I'll say, broader population, the business community. And it was interesting when I was talking to some friends about this conversation I was going to get to have today over the weekend. I was talking to a friend has multiple, degrees in business and accounting, and he's actually quite progressive. But as I started to talk about this, he interrupted me and said, well, but aren't they all just really hardened criminals? Why is this such a passionate topic for you? And I said, gosh, they're not. And he didn't even know what I was talking about. And I just, as we try to broaden the involvement with the broader population of folks and educate people, I mean, what are your thoughts about that sentiment? Aren't they all a bunch of hardened criminals and what that means?
Of course, I hear it all the time. It is the narrative of this administration. These hardened criminals, these savages that we need to send to other shores and so on. It's an enormously destructive narrative. Number one, as you say, it's false. I'm not really sure what hardened criminal means. I believe in the capacity of everyone for change. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen for everyone, but I certainly think it's our job as a society to, give people the best circumstances with which to build and rebuild lives. And so I just object even to that term, hardened criminal. I've seen, in my life and work, and I'm surrounded by people who are in prison, who've been to prison. They're, it's the deepest people in my life are folks who've experienced that. And I've seen people come around and change and, de-harden, so to speak, at all kinds of phases. That's one. Two is just that, the data doesn't back this up. Like, first of all, if we talk about pretrial detention alone, there are huge numbers of people who are legally innocent behind bars. And when we look, this is true in the US, certainly, but when we look outside the US, and especially in the global South and countries like the Philippines, Trinidad, like you're talking about upward Dominican Republic, 70-80% of systems are people who haven't even been convicted of anything. So you're talking about legally innocent people. And then you got to recognize that you're also talking about, so many countries where substances are illegal, where cannabis is illegal. Add to that a legacy of what is known in the global South as petty offenses. We call them misdemeanors. But throughout the world, you have these old colonial offenses on the books, things like loitering, loud music, using expletives in a public setting. Like, there are lots and lots of people locked up all over the world for these petty offenses. In fact, there's an entire organization devoted to decriminalizing these petty offenses around the world in various countries that used to be colonies. So it's both wrong and inhumane to use that kind of language and talk that kind of talk.
It seems easier to say they're all hardened criminals or they're all bad people, or it's too difficult to fix, even though we're not trying to fix it. We need to completely change it. And I just wonder, what is the world in which, why is it so much harder to lead with empathy and to talk about rehabilitation than it is to just say, lock people up, harden criminals? Like there's just there's like two lanes and we can't seem to get out of one to get into the other. And so I know, not to pivot too quickly into like the rest of the world and who is not using the US as a model, but I'd be curious to hear from you, Baz, like who are the people that are leading with empathy?
I would say, instead of thinking about empathy, I would say context. And by context, I mean understanding where people's quote unquote choices come from. And I put choices in quotation marks because when we're talking about systemic inequality, systemic racism that is, built into the foundation of this country, that is built into the way we live, some people don't have choice the way others do. In many communities, crime and, poor choices are normalized. And I think what we're really bad at, and we've always been bad at this in the US, but I think we're now especially bad at it in the era of AI and social media, is like understanding the larger fabric of society from which actions come, from which poor choices are made, from which crime comes. Crime comes from a context. That doesn't justify it. I'm not saying it's all good and, no, not at all. I'm horrified by crime. I want to live in a safe community. We all do. But understanding the context of things and, the root cause of them and the structural, like the systemic stuff behind them is really, really important. And we're terrible at systems think in the US.
To your point about coming from a literature background, I think context is something that we find in fiction and storytelling and literature, and have a deeper understanding. And maybe that does, for me, it leads to empathy, but I think the two are really closely tied together. And so I think that's, again, to bring it back to your background in literature, I think is really interesting.
I also think you're raising an interesting point. Like, what is the point of all of this? And as you had asked Tanya, like, who's doing a good job, of, using these systems for something that actually supports people in a positive way? I mean, who are you seeing actually do that. And as it relates to that, like, why is this so partisan? It feels like supporting our communities and our people and making sure that we all are the best we can be and the strongest we could be would be something we would want for our society and our communities.
I think the bipartisan reality, yes, this is a bipartisan issue because justice is bipartisan, safety, which is the end goal of all this, no doubt. And there was a moment, actually, I think in the last, maybe 5 years ago, where there was a lot of actually bipartisan work in this regard.
I thought I saw that. Yeah, even the last Trump administration.
The First Step Act and so on. I mean, those were, somewhat controversial, and there's still a lot of disagreement and division in the movement over whether that was genuine bipartisanship, whether it was the right move, et cetera, et cetera. But it was. I think what's happening now is that we're just, there's agreement that we want safety, but there's just disagreement over what produces safety. In part because the current administration and the current discourse, again, removal of all context, no conversation about systems and structures, entirely blaming bad people, criminals, and so on. And that's very American. Like, America is all about the American dream is me pick myself up by my bootstraps, right? Not recognizing that some people never have boots. Like, we love to remove context. We love to focus on individual choice over and above systems and structures. So this conversation, the current discourse, makes perfect sense in that regard. It's just taken to its logical conclusion. This is entirely about bad people doing bad things. As per the idea of who isn't, talking that way and pursuing such an agenda, I get asked that a lot. The first thing I like to point out is that there's no one country that has all the answers or one place. So much of the work that I and we do at Incarceration Nations Network is to look at pockets of progress everywhere. And there's good work being done in lots of places. So it's not about necessarily pointing to, let's copycat this country, but rather looking at strong, organizations that are doing innovative stuff. I think Argentina is a great example of that. The current administration, the Malek administration, is not one you would think of as being, and in fact, is dismantling.
I'm surprised to hear you say that. Yeah.
Right. So from a government perspective, it's quite frustrating. On the other hand, some of our best partners are in Argentina. They're cooperatives that are building, they're formerly incarcerated families who have created cooperatives to ensure inclusion in the labor market. They have some of the best university and prison programs in the world. And, they built this without government, sometimes in spite of government, and usually on a shoestring budget. And so, that, for instance, is a country I would point to and say there's amazing understanding of what movement building is, what solidarity is, what community is, what non-hierarchical movement building is in particular. So, it's really an exciting place for movement. On the other hand, I would point, there are some governments, Scandinavia tends to get a lot of hype, Norway in particular. I have a chapter on Norway in my book. We have partners in Norway. I've been to Finland too, to the prisons. And they've got these open prison models where people are able to leave and remain effectively part of their communities, even as they're incarcerated, which is enormous. Their prisons that are closed have a lot more programming. But what I always point out to people about the, Scandinavian approach is that it can't be looked at in a vacuum.
Right.
What's so powerful about Norway and Sweden and, various places like this is that they have something really radical called social services. They've got an incredible healthcare system, education system. And so it's a holistic social service net that is therefore going to produce less crime, less inequality, which produces less crime. It's kind of a no-brainer,
Right.
More equality equals safer communities. And so generally, when you look at the most unequal societies, the US, South Africa, right? These are the most unequal, some of the most unequal countries in the world. No wonder, Brazil, no wonder the crime rates are as high as they are. They're directly correlated with inequality. So when we want to look at examples, we need to look beyond examples of like the prettier prisons, as I call them. and look at deeper stuff that is preventing crime in the first place. And then when crime occurs, is addressing it in a more humane fashion.